My name is Isabel Rohr, and I'm the Manager of Academic Programs and Outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to this public lecture sponsored by the JDC Archives in the context of the Sorel and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship Program. The goal of the Sorel and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship is to enable scholars engaged in graduate-level, postdoctoral, or independent research to conduct research in the JDC Archives. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its creation about 104 years ago, is one of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and others. Our speaker today, Dr. Gaelle Fischer, is the recipient of the Sorel and Lauren Chessin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2018. Gaelle Fischer is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, Germany. She earned her PhD in history from University College in London. In 2018, Gaelle Fischer was the recipient of a European Holocaust Research Infrastructure Fellowship at the Elie Wiesel National Institute for the Study of the Holocaust in Romania, in Bucharest. She has taught German and Eastern European history at University College London in the United Kingdom and at the University of Augsburg in Germany. She has published articles in the journals of German history, Leo Baeck Institute Yearbook, and East European Politics and Societies. She is the co-editor of the special cluster Bukovina and Bukovinians after 1945, Reshaping and Rethinking a Region After Genocide and Ethnic Unmixing, which is published in East European Politics and Societies in 2019. She's also the co-editor of the forthcoming issue of European Holocaust Studies entitled The Holocaust in the Borderlands, Interethnic Relations and the Dynamics of Violence in Occupied Eastern Europe. She's conducting research in the JDC Archives for a book project which deals with the history of the Holocaust in Romania. Covering the decade from 1938 to 1948, this study seeks to reconstruct the changing perception, beliefs, and strategies of Jewish leaders against the backdrop of the different forms of persecution and hardship faced by Romanian Jewish communities across political regimes. This afternoon, she will present on this topic, Making Sense of Catastrophe, Jewish Leadership in Romania During the Holocaust. Our format is that the speaker will present for 45 minutes, and this will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Thank you.
I would like to begin by thanking you all for attending, and the staff at the JDC Archives for welcoming me and looking after me so well, and especially Sorel and Lauren Chessin, who have made my visit possible by generously funding it and who thereby contribute to supporting my work. As I set out to carry out this research, I am truly grateful for this help, as well as for the opportunity to speak to you today. I will be discussing my new project, of which you see the broader title here, and I look forward to your questions. In November 2014, on the occasion of the celebration of the American Joint Distribution Committee's centenary of activities in Romania, a symposium was organized in Bucharest. The meeting's subject was Wilhelm Felderman, the second president of the Joint in Romania. Filderman, who was born in Bucharest in 1882 and died in Paris in 1963, held the position of the head of the Joint in Romania for 27 years, from 1920 to 1947, when, under the threat of arrest, he fled Romania for France. Filderman was certainly chosen as the subject of the symposium because of his role within the Joint. But as the publication the publication of short essays about him published on this occasion clearly showed, Wilhelm Felderman was many other things as well. The book's title, which you can see here, reads Wilhelm Felderman, an uncontested leader of Romanian Jews. It starts with extracts from his autobiography, describing his modest origins, studies in Paris, where he obtained a doctorate in law in 1909, and his early career, especially his role at the post-World War I peace conferences. This is followed by 14 contributions authored by more or less famous Jewish and non-Jewish Romanian intellectuals, offering further details about Filderman's life, career, and achievements as a lawyer, politician, and the leader of virtually all of the non-Zionist Jewish organizations in Romania between World War I and World War II. The book leaves no doubt as to the respect and even the admiration many had and have for this individual, both those who knew him personally and those who have studied his legacy. The contributions emphasize his courage, intelligence, hard work, dignity, and even his heroism. Indeed, Filderman is believed to have played an instrumental role in the survival of nearly half of the Jews who had lived in Romania before World War II, some 350,000 people during the Holocaust. At the same time, the contributors to this volume, as others have too, underscore not only his commitment to the community, to Jews, but also his patriotism, his deep and genuine attachment to Romania. Viewed in the context of the wider history of Jews in Europe in the first half of the 20th century, Filderman's story of upward mobility, uninterrupted leadership, and survival is unquestionably exceptional. With in mind Romania's history and the country's notorious reputation for anti-Semitism, this story is perhaps even more remarkable. But saying how remarkable the story is, or even how remarkable the man was, only takes us so far. It does not allow us to question or understand our own assumptions. This remarkableness, therefore, is something that deserves to be examined, explained, and placed in a wider context. This is the aim of my project, which concentrates on the Romanian Jewish leadership in Bucharest and their institutions in the difficult years between 1938 and 1948. My work sets out to analyze leading individuals' interactions with others, both within the community and beyond, including Romanian and German perpetrators, but also international Jewish organizations such as the Joint. This study examines these figures' changing and evolving strategies, experiences, and beliefs. The aim is to shed new light on their degree of agency, namely their ability to question existing frameworks and concepts in the midst of persecution and at different moments in time. Simply put, how did Romanian Jewish leaders make sense of the catastrophe unfolding around them? So in what follows, I will give you a brief insight into my work and its wider framework. I will begin with a concise overview of the Holocaust in Romania, which I conceive of as a distinct yet integral chapter of the history of the mass murder of European Jews. I will then say a few words about my approach, and finally I will illustrate what I am interested in more concretely by focusing on an example and some primary material regarding a particular moment in 1943. The systematic persecution of the Jews in Romania started in late 1937 with the formation of the first openly anti-Jewish government in Romania, the Goga-Cuza government, the second anti-Semitic government to come to power in Europe. Although this government soon fell, some of the anti-Semitic legislation it initiated, inspired by the Nuremberg laws, was later maintained. Aside from a number of professional bans, in the process, 250,000 Romanian Jews, namely around 1 in 3 Jews in Romania, lost their citizenship and their civil rights. Most of them came from the borderland regions of Romania, which you can see here on the map, the so-called new provinces acquired after World War I. From left to right, Transylvania, Banat, Krishna, Maramuresh, Bukovina, and Bessarabia. Persecution reached a new level in the summer of 1940 after Romania's major wartime losses of territory, the loss of northern Transylvania to Hungary with the Second Vienna Award, and northern Bukovina and Bessarabia to the Soviet Union following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The lost territories are colored darker gray on the map. With Jews being blamed for the setbacks, physical attacks on Jews became ever more frequent and severe. Ultimately, these territorial losses triggered the political crisis of the summer of 1940, which brought General, later Marshal, Ion Antonescu to power in an alliance with the fascist legionaries in September 1940. Although the alliance with the fascists broke down within a few months, the Antonescu regime continued to order and condone violence against Jews thereafter. The most notorious and gruesome incidents were the pogroms in Bucharest in January 1941 and in the city of Iași in late June, early July 1941, an episode during which an estimated 14,000 Jews were murdered. The next phase of the Holocaust in Romania started when Romania joined the German attack on the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, and Romanian armed forces both participated in German and committed their own mass crimes in the reconquered territories of northern Bukovina and Bessarabia and newly conquered areas of southwestern Ukraine. Then, in the fall of 1941, in spite of protests on behalf of the Jewish leadership in Bucharest, Antonescu ordered the deportation of the surviving Jews from these borderland provinces to what came to be known as Transnistria, the territory you see here on the right of both maps. As the name suggests, the area lies beyond the Dniester, between the rivers Dniester and Bug. Transnistria was more or less given to the Romanians by the Germans to make up for the loss of northern Transylvania. Under Romanian administration, it soon became a massive open-air detention zone for Jews. Over 100 makeshift camps and ghettos were set up for around 200,000 surviving local and deported Jews and about 20,000 Sinti and Roma. Abandoned without proper housing, food, or means of subsistence, tens of thousands of people interned in this way died of cold, hunger, and disease. Others, many of those who were sent to areas of German control, were shot or worked to death. Only around 50,000 people are believed to have survived the ordeal of Transnistria. In the meantime, over the course of 1941-1942, the Jews remaining in the Romanian Old Kingdom, Wallachia and Moldavia, as well as southern Transylvania, were subject to ever more extensive policies of so-called Romanianization, resulting in expropriations, extortions, redundancies, and demotions on a massive scale. Moreover, tens of thousands of Jews were mobilized for forced labor, and sporadic deportations to Transnistria took place from here too. It is hard to evaluate how many people died as a direct result of these circumstances, but it is clear that the situation in this period was extremely precarious for Jews in Romania in every sense. From 1941 onwards, the Nazis had representatives in Bucharest, Eichmann's men, whose task was to pressurize the Romanian government into deporting Romanian Jews to the extermination camp of Bejec. This threat remained constant, continuing even after Antonescu started allowing Jewish relief activities in Transnistria to develop. It is unclear whether Antonescu acted out of opportunism, greed, pride, or any other motive, but the fact that he never delivered Romanian Jews wholesale to the Germans explains how hundreds of thousands managed to survive in the country. Yet it is important to emphasize that the other half were murdered. Moreover, at the end of World War II, while Romania's Jewish community was the second largest in Europe, the community was decimated, exhausted, famished, propertyless, and ruined. For survivors, hardship and even discrimination did not end overnight. As documents here in this archive and elsewhere amply testify, the treatment of Jews during the war meant that when World War II came to an end, Romania was the site of a veritable Jewish humanitarian crisis. So now just a few words about my approach. Thanks to the research conducted over the last few decades, we know a great deal about what happened in Romania during the war. However, up until now, with respect to the topic of the Holocaust in Romania, priority has generally not been given to the Jewish perspective, Jewish experiences and suffering. Rather, the focus has been placed on the fact that, on the one hand, compared to elsewhere, many Jews survived the persecution in Romania, and on the other, on the fact that no other nation participated on such a scale and with such fervor in the Nazi genocide. As a result, a great deal of attention has been paid to the intentions and the motives of Romanian perpetrators. Questions such as how anti-Semitic was Antonescu, how close was he to Hitler, how lethal and how widespread was Romanian anti-Semitism, what motivated those who did kill and those who did not, and how was the robbing of Jews justified and carried out. These are unquestionably important questions. But in a sense, the story has often been told with the outcome in mind, and this has concentrated attention on the perpetrators, who indeed ultimately had the power to determine this outcome. One of the consequences is that in the process, the experiences of the victims, their complexity, their diversity, and particularly the conjunctures of their situation, have been largely overlooked. This project's main aim, therefore, is to retell this story from an angle that does justice to how this time was experienced by Jews. While focusing on the leadership as the most visible group, the idea is to do this in a manner that contributes to differentiating the notion of the Jews during the Holocaust and in Romania in particular, highlighting the uneven distribution of power, but also reflecting on the wider concept of Jewish response and the meaning of and significance of notions and conceptions of identity, subjectivity, community, solidarity, morality, collective responsibility in these acute times. So in order to be more concrete about what I mean, I will now turn to an example. The example, or rather the moment I want to focus on here, is the deportation of Wilhelm Felderman to the ghetto of Mogilev-Podolsk in Transnistria in the summer of 1943. This is a notorious event, relatively well documented and often mentioned in biographies of Filderman. It is, for instance, alluded to in many of the contributions about him in the book I mentioned at the start. Often it is referred to exemplify the extent of his personal courage and self-sacrifice. But as I would like to argue, looked at more closely, it is a revealing event in other ways too, and on other levels. There can be no doubt that this move on behalf of the Romanian authorities came as a huge shock. It was a significant and dramatic moment, both for Filderman as an individual and symbolically for the Romanian Jewish community as a whole. At the time, Filderman was over 60 years old. Tens of thousands of Jews had been deported to Transnistria in the previous years, and the conditions there were known to be extremely harsh, with widespread illness and starvation. Beyond this, having allowed him to survive in Bucharest until then, the decision appeared to signal a drastic turn of events. As Siegfried Jagendorf, the head of the foundry in Mogilev and an important figure there, noted in his memoir, I quote, "A shocking event occurred on June 1st, 1943. Dr. Wilhelm Felderman, the most influential Jew in all of Romania, the man to whom we looked for deliverance, arrived in Mogilev as a deportee. We took this to mean that all of us would go in the way prescribed by Hitler and Antonescu," end quote. However, the circumstances of Filderman's deportation deserve further contextualization. For one thing, Filderman was deported 1.5 years after the deportations to Transnistria had begun, together with his wife, and repatriated after just 2 months. While this unquestionably was a harrowing experience, this was not the typical experience of deportation to Transnistria, what being deported and interned had meant for tens of thousands of others. Besides, Mogilev-Podolsk was one of the better organized ghettos with a kind of Jewish self-administration. Once there, Filderman was treated with special respect and attention, provided with a room opposite Engineer Jagendorf's home, and given a special guard. His deportation also prompted a series of domestic and international reactions. In general, deporting the man who was seen by many as the foremost leader of Romanian Jews triggered a small political crisis. But as I would like to argue, the deportation was also symptomatic of an existing and wider crisis for the regime, and I think it should be analyzed as such as well. What I want to do in what follows is look closer at the circumstances of Filderman's deportation, because I believe this event can tell us about the situation of Jews in Romania at this time, the relationship between different Jewish and non-Jewish actors, and Filderman's status for these different actors, as well as about Romania at this particular moment of the war and the Holocaust. Therefore, I think it can provide insight into the wider dynamics of power and vulnerability I am interested in exploring in my work more generally. The background for Filderman's deportation was a request put to the Jewish community in May 1943 to pay a so-called special Jewish tax of 4 billion Romanian lei to the state, the equivalent of about $1 million. The first 2 billion were due within 30 days, and the next 2 within a few months. The justification for this alleged tax or levy was that since Jews were not partaking in the war effort as soldiers, they were instead at liberty, I quote, of engaging in commerce and thereby getting richer by the day. As was often the case, the Romanian authorities referred to policies implemented in other Axis countries, arguing that they were merely doing the same. Whoever did not comply, and this primarily concerned the Jewish leadership supposed to collect the sums from the Jewish population, was explicitly threatened with deportation to Transnistria. This appeal fitted within a wider pattern of extortion which had been going on for years. The argument of the need for a Jewish contribution to the war effort was also not new. But it was a higher sum than any previously requested, and in view of the community's physical and material situation by 1943, a wholly unreasonable one too. The request was put to the community through the Jewish Central, Centrala Evreilor din România, which had existed since early 1942, when independent Jewish institutions had officially been banned and dissolved. The Central was a kind of Jewish council, a Judenrat of sorts, a collaborationist organization controlled by the state, with at its head a Jewish physician who had converted to Catholicism, Nandor Gingold. But in practice, the allegedly disempowered traditional Jewish leaders, including Filderman, remained the only ones with any real authority to extract the 4 billion, and the demand was therefore put to them first. Thereupon, Filderman, adopting a strategy he had used many times before, wrote a long letter to contest the measure. This letter, though addressed to Gingold, the president of the Central, appears to have reached Ion Antonescu, who then, apparently insulted by its contents, decided to retaliate by deporting Filderman to Transnistria. So that's the summary of what happened. The first thing which is interesting to look at more closely is Filderman's response, an elaborate text of several pages. The arguments were made in the structured, cogent, and convincing manner which had become typical of his frequent petitions to the government and of his legal mind and mode of argumentation. As we know from the sources, he had been helped by his assistant, Arnold Schwefferberg, who was also a lawyer. In an earlier document, Schwefferberg had outlined in detail why the sum was too high, the deadline untenable, and such an amount simply unobtainable from Jews in Romania at this point in time. Filderman, who composed his response a couple of days later, combined economic and political arguments. He focused on the fact that it was not true that Jews in other countries had been made pay similar sums. He pointed out that if Jews were not fighting in the army, it was because they were kept out of it by the regime itself. He added that it was not true that they were getting rich, not least because Jews had to do unpaid forced labor, and that if they did not, that was because they were deemed to be doing jobs that were useful to the country, and in that case, surely they did not deserve a fine. He went on to say that whoever might have been wealthy once would have already had their assets confiscated. By this point, firms and businesses were no longer in Jewish hands. He ended his statement, I quote, with the statement, I quote, "Where should these billions requested from the Jews come from, as the Jews are the victims and not the beneficiaries of Romanianization?" He then outlined all the other taxes and disadvantages Jews faced. He even quoted Antonescu, who was once said to have said, I quote, "A man is a man, whatever his creed, and justice will be done to those who are entitled to it and demand it." As Filderman continued, I quote, "Although we are Jews, we are not any less human beings." He concluded this section by saying, "I have profound respect for the Marshal, and I know he is too sensitive to human suffering and too fixed in his convictions as to not to consider the Jews to be human beings and to do them justice," end quote. Filderman then said he would be prepared to go to Transnistria and emphasized that the refusal to pay was not the result of bad will, but impossibility. He concluded he was convinced that if Antonescu read about the situation, he would understand. As Filderman added later, the requested sum of money actually amounted to the entire income of the Jews in Romania for 3 consecutive years. The contrast between this informed argumentation and honest and rational language and the hypocrisy and cynicism of the measures imposed on Jews and their justification is remarkable. It captures Filderman's erudition and skill, but also his dignity and confidence, as reflected in his courage and the willingness to engage in a discussion with the perpetrators as though they were equals and as though they were decent. It also shows he did not lose hope or give in to despair. It is worth noting that Filderman also gave the letter to a handful of ministerial members whom he thought would be in his favor, and he even received a letter of encouragement from one of them. Another document I would like to draw your attention to is the detailed account of Filderman's deportation as reported on by Filderman's secretaries and right-hand men. Here, one gets a sense of how well surrounded Filderman actually was, how much recognition and support he benefited from in different circles, including underground. The fact that he was threatened with deportation leaked as early as mid-May 1943. On the 21st, the news was confirmed by several further contacts working for the Jewish Central, and the leaks and attempts to avert his deportation continued in this way daily up until June 1st, when he was eventually arrested. From May 27th onwards, there is an hour-by-hour depiction of Filderman's whereabouts in the days before his deportation. This is what you can see here, showing how different people were mobilized and seeking to avert his banishment, as well as discussing how it came to this and what response to prepare. Among others, the chief rabbi, Alexander Safran, contacted various influential people. Filderman's doctor, a non-Jewish Romanian, made a statement regarding his ill health. His temperature was even artificially raised. On May 30th, Filderman wrote an emotional letter directly to Antonescu in which he explained that by obeying the order of deportation, he was abandoning everything he had been committed to, 30 years of public life, work, and sacrifice for his country. He asked Antonescu to hear him out concerning his alleged irreverence, insisting the letter of contest had not been addressed to him or meant for him, but to Gingold, the president of the Jewish Central. Filderman noted that, I quote, "Of course, the structure of a letter written by a Jew to the president of the Jews is different to that of a letter written to the head of the state," end quote. He then reminded Antonescu he had written many other reports in the past which had not had such dire consequences. As this shows, Filderman not only emphasized his credentials, but tried to put himself in the place of the marshal, tried to follow his nationalist and anti-Semitic logic and understand why he felt so insulted, but to no avail. Another interesting source are the reactions in the international, particularly in the German press. Unsurprisingly, the newspaper of the Gestapo in Bucharest, the Bucharest Tageblatt, reported on the circumstances, but so did German newspapers elsewhere. An article in the Hessische Zeitung from May 29, 1943, stated that Filderman had finally been neutralized and that he would be locked up until the end of the war. He was accused of being behind the, I quote, "huge economic and political power accumulated by Romanian Jews in the interwar period, of bringing about the fall of the anti-Semitic Goga-Cuza government in 1938, thanks to his international contacts, and of continuing to work underground under Antonescu." He also concluded that the Swiss reports concerning the easing of policies towards Jews in Romania were not true. A similar raving article appeared the same day in the Berliner Börsenzeitung, and another, rhetorically much more aggressive and anti-Semitic, appeared in the Völkische Beobachter's Vienna edition, concluding with obvious delight, I quote, "In this way, handcuffs have finally been placed around the hands of one of the most awful agents of world Jewry in Europe, which needed to be destroyed," end quote. A similar article in the Berlin issue on June 1st explained that Filderman was faking illness and concluded, "Filderman's latest impertinence will be his loss. In Transnistria, he will be able to reflect on whether it was a good idea to test the patience of the state leader Marshal Antonescu in this way." These articles capture both the relish at Filderman's arrest and the fact that he was taken rather seriously by the Nazis as a threat to their aims. This is also confirmed by the fact that there had been German plans to deport Filderman to Germany as early as April 1943 on grounds of espionage, and that the Germans attempted to assassinate him twice while he was in Transnistria. The little one can find out about Filderman's actual time in Transnistria is also interesting. Here's a picture of him taken in Mogilev. He's at the front in the middle. When he arrived in Mogilev, as mentioned, he was taken care of by Jagendorf and immediately given housing. After the Germans' first attempt on his life, he got a personal, though unarmed, guard. Filderman was known, recognized, and clearly had authority here too. He soon turned his home into an office to receive deportees and their representatives, find out about their situation, and advise them. He helped them organize relief, aid, food deliveries, and claim more, lobby for repatriation, improve their working conditions and pay, improve communication with other parts of the country, negotiate rules pertaining to parcels, travel, and the transparency of financial transactions. As surviving correspondence shows, he was in contact with the heads of different ghettos in Transnistria, such as Moshe Katz, the deputy head of Turin ghetto. Evidence also shows that in the meantime in Bucharest, the concern about the situation of Jews in Transnistria in general, and Filderman's situation in particular, as well as regarding the Jewish tax issue, did not lessen. On June 11th, Gingold wrote to the community via the front page of the Jewish newspaper, Gazeta Evreiasca, with what he called an explanation, in fact, a renewed call to comply and pay up. But Filderman's associates immediately denounced the inaccuracies and misleading statements this article contained. Later, they also wrote a report explaining that Filderman's initial letter had been misunderstood. It had not been addressed to Antonescu, but meant for internal use. It had stated correct figures and was not meant to be offensive, but realistic. They emphasized Filderman's spotless credentials. The report was concluded with the statement that Filderman had been gone a month, was not well, and needed care. I quote, care which he could not get in Transnistria. And further, the disappearance of such a personality with international contacts that served the country in the past and can serve it in the future could not be in anyone's interest, end quote. In light of the international situation in 1943, this was a powerful argument. Pressure was mounting on Antonescu to put through Filderman's release, as well as to improve the situation of Jews in Transnistria in general. A range of people are said to have expressed concern regarding Filderman's situation, including the Queen Mother, the papal nuncio, and some foreign diplomats. On July 8, 1943, while Filderman was still in Mogilev, Antonescu approved of principles on the basis of which the repatriation of certain categories of Jews from Transnistria could take place on a case-by-case basis. A couple of weeks later, on July 21st, rumors concerning the decision to repatriate Filderman emerged. The second failed attempt on Filderman's life by the Germans appears to have been decisive. Antonescu may have thought the death of the Jewish leader would be too contentious. On July 30th, 1943, overnight, Filderman was taken back across the Dniester. The reactions to Filderman's repatriation ranged from anger among the Germans and anti-Semites to relief internationally among the Allies and his own prominent supporters at home, such as the Queen Mother, Elena, whom he wrote to in gratitude upon his return. His return was also welcomed by Jews who remained in Transnistria. A letter from Moshe Katz on July 31st expressed huge thanks for the help provided and hope that Filderman would be able to do even more for them now he was back in Bucharest. This appears to have been the case. His impressive first-hand accounts of what he had seen helped spur further action on Transnistria, and no more than 700,000 lei were ever paid towards the 4 billion. With hindsight, the summer of 1943 was a key turning point in Romania's policy towards Jews. From then on, the relief for Jews in Transnistria increased consistently. In late 1943, Antonescu eventually gave the order for repatriation of a first group of orphans from the region. As some historians believe, this may have been linked to the situation of the Axis on the Eastern Front, about which Romanians, as Germany's closest ally, military ally, were better informed than any others. But others believe Romanian decisions had their own logic and dynamics. It is interesting to think about the circumstances of Filderman's deportation and repatriation in this context, maybe not as an event that amounted to an admission of powerlessness or a decisive kind of defeat for the Romanian regime, but as a symptom of a shift. It is a situation that illuminates some of the many factors determining the wider unpredictability and inconsistency of the Romanian authorities' policies towards Jews during the Holocaust. I am also interested in what the circumstances of Filderman's deportation, how the events unfolded, can tell us about Filderman's status, stature, and standing, his image in Romania and abroad, his relationships and means, and therefore the kind of power he leveraged. These circumstances show us what kind of actions, negotiations, and approaches made him into the character remembered today, but also shed light on the social, political, and cultural environment that made these actions possible. This instrumental interplay of different actors, but also of individuals and institutions, structures and agency, strategy and contingency, is key to understanding this history as it is to the history of many other extreme moments. And if I have allowed myself to digress in this way today, it is because I believe this is also helpful to understand the joint's history in this time and later, in its constant negotiation between local circumstances and transnational and even global events and trends, individuals, institutions, and governments. To conclude, the question of Jewish responses and reactions to persecution has long interested historians, especially Jewish historians. One should name Yehuda Bauer's seminal work, Reactions to the Holocaust, published in English in 1989, and Isaiah Trunk's work on Jewish councils, Judenrat, published in the 1970s, and Arnold Pauker's lifelong work on the German Jewry. For Romania, a key historian in this respect is Leah Benjamin, who, as soon as this was possible, after 1989, published many works on responses and resistance, including many invaluable primary source collections with this focus. Looking at the work done more recently, one sees that the conceptualization of Jewish resistance and reactions has become, on the one hand, ever more differentiated, and on the other, that scholars have increasingly sought to identify new patterns. Many historians have tried to categorize reactions and redefine terms like resistance, compliance, corruption, and cooperation in different contexts. An especially compelling new addition to the literature is Yevgeny Finker's recent study entitled Ordinary Jews. As a political scientist, Finker presents a typology of reactions, which I think is very useful. But beyond this, based on his quantitative and as well as qualitative and comparative research, he concludes that Jews who had experiences of previous political activism were much more likely to cooperate and resist. He therefore emphasizes the significance of pre-Holocaust political regimes and stances for what happened during the Holocaust, the past, in other words, as a predictor of behavior. In general, new work demonstrates the importance of taking into account both national contexts and transnational conditions for understanding Jewish reactions during the Holocaust. This helps reconnect research on the Holocaust with knowledge and work on Jewish identities and traditions and different brands of anti-Semitism. The cases of Romania and Filderman and what has been called the system of petitions illustrates the potential of such an approach especially well. As Yehuda Bauer wrote, Filderman was a typical representative of what in medieval times had been known as a Jewish Stadtlan, a lobbyist, with all the positive qualities of a Stadtlan. He made use of any chink in the armor and exploited any opportunity for intervening with the authorities, and he demonstrated with uncompromising logic the senselessness of the anti-Jewish policies from the point of view of the Romanian authorities themselves. According to Bauer, he deployed a method of dignified and stubborn lobbying. The different modes and wider circumstances of this lobbying are what I am interested in exploring further. Just like the Holocaust in Romania can be said to be both an integral chapter of the European Holocaust and a distinct one in terms of the timing of events, the spaces concerned, and the actors involved, any analysis of the circumstances of its victims needs to account for the complex interplay of local and external factors and the personal and institutional particularities of this case. It requires, in other words, a consideration of the characteristics and antecedents of Romanian Jewish persecution and responses. As the example of Filderman's deportation in 1943 served to show, in this situation, he did not act in isolation, and he drew to a large extent on past relationships and experiences to try to influence and make sense of what was happening to him and to Romanian Jews as a whole. The history of the Jewish leadership in Romania, therefore, needs to be embedded in a much wider set of cultural, ideological, and power political circumstances and conditions, and analyzed with a range of transnational and interpersonal relationships in mind. This is why I'm here, to research Filderman's and other Jewish leaders' work within and with the Joint. Aside from looking to find out what concrete aid Jews abroad could or tried to offer their brethren in the catastrophic decade for Jews in Romania from 1938 to 1948, and how they made sense of what was happening in Europe, I am also exploring what I believe are key aspects of Romanian Jewish leaders' experiences, namely the social, political, and intellectual capital that informed and shaped the strategies deployed and the beliefs they held throughout this difficult period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaelle, for this lecture. We now have about 15 minutes for question and answers.
There were two other countries which are allied with Germany during the war, Italy and Hungary, and both of them succeeded to survive to have the Jews survive until they changed direction, until they decided Italy surrendered after American deployment in the south, and with Hungary which happened in late of summer of 1943, and in Hungary happened in March 1944. And then the mass deportation and extermination of the Jews in Italy and Hungary happened. The Hungarian Jews lived quite well till 1944. So the major reason for survival of the Romanian Jews up to this point can be attributed to Filderman and development on the Russian front, particularly at Stalingrad, where the breakthrough happens through the Romanian lines, and the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where the German again suffered a bad defeat. So the Romanian Jews could have also been, Romania could have been occupied had Antonescu decided to change direction, but he was a constant ally of Hitler. In fact, he saw Hitler in June 44 and August 44, he said, I will continue to fight with you. So the major reason for the survival is due probably to the Romanian king and the Queen Mother, who performed the coup d'etat in August 23rd and allowed the Russian troops to come through the line, and Germans had to retreat fast without being able to deport the Jews. So did you do any research about that?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and it kind of fits a little bit with what I said at some point about the existing literature and the fact that this is the most, what you've described is in a way a very important question. It's like, how was this outcome possible? And obviously, to answer that, those who had the power in this context were obviously, to call them with a category, the perpetrators. But so this is a question on which there is a lot of literature. Like how did Antonescu's stance determine the fate of the Jews in Romania? Or how did the situation on the front determine the situation? It's not something I personally am working on specifically, because I'm more interested in how did Jews who couldn't know what this outcome would be, how did they deal with the daily and continuing difficulties they faced, if you see what I mean. But it is, of course, it's a fascinating question of what was decisive. I think that in a way it's impossible to reach a point where there's one single answer. But if Romania had been occupied by the Germans, I think the situation or the fate of the Jews would have been very different. Yeah. But the question is why did Antonescu not deliver Jews? And this is a question on which there is a great deal of literature. Yeah.
One thing, but on the other thing, his willingness to hang on with Hitler, till the bitter end, that also helped the Jews in a very ironic way.
Paradoxical way, yeah.
Because prevented Hitler from occupying Romania.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you for a very enlightening talk. One facet that you didn't touch on that interests me about Jewish leadership in Romania during this time period is the difference between Romanian Jews and Jews in Romania. Because after World War I and the Treaty of Trianon, a large, significant minority of Jews in Romania were actually Hungarian by identification. So in the sense of Filderman as a leader, did he have the respect of the Hungarian portion of the Jews in Romania as well? And if not, were there alternate centers of Jewish leadership during the interwar period?
Yes, that's again a very good question. So generally speaking about the concept of Romanian Jews, it doesn't really work historically. I would fully agree. Initially when I planned the talk, I had thought of being more careful with that, and then it's just extremely complicated. But of course, the majority of Hungarian-speaking Jews in Romania were in northern Transylvania, and northern Transylvania was lost to Romania in 1940. So they therefore had the Romanian Jewish leadership, if you like, in Bucharest, didn't consider themselves leaders of those people. As for the relationship to the Jews in southern Transylvania, who may also have been Hungarian speaking, I actually don't know enough about it to say much, and especially not to answer the interesting question about whether there was another center of power. This is something I intend to look into. But I do know that when there was a threat to deport the Jews from southern Transylvania, the leadership in Bucharest, including especially the Rabbi Safran, did all he could to prevent this. And so I think the priority from the sources I've looked at so far, the priority for Filderman and the people around him was Transnistria, and for obvious reasons, because these were the most endangered people. But it's a good question, thank you.
What happened to Filderman after the war, like briefly, and when did he end up in France?
Yeah, so after the war, he remained the leader of the Jewish community as the war came to an end. I mean, his role, when he returned from Transnistria, he adopted an ever more important role in the activities of the Jewish community, both underground and then officially. But then when the communist takeover in Romania led to him being branded an enemy insofar as he was accused of having somehow cooperated with the fascists in order to survive. And in late 1947, he heard, again, a similar story in a way, but he heard he was going to be arrested, and then he fled the country before that happened. And then more or less retired, lived in France with many honorary activities, but no official role.
I heard you describe Filderman as both the head of the Union of Jewish Communities in Romania and as head of the Joint in Romania. And that usually is a differentiated role, not necessarily the same person. I am not personally familiar with the situation with Filderman and Romania, but I'm curious to understand that a little bit more.
Yes, I actually thought quite a bit about, I mean, he obviously wasn't, you know, the country director. He was just the representative in a way, in the country, in Romania. His accumulation in a way of leadership roles is really striking and impressive. I just think he got given this position after the Joint reduced its activities immediately after World War I. The Joint was very active in Romania, but they at some point closed an office, and then I think Filderman became this person they trusted and therefore had there as coordinating their activities, and he just stayed in that position. And obviously, I think, this is partly what I'm here to research on, but the Joint's activities in Romania changed over time, and then therefore so did his role, let's say. But he was always the person, the top person, basically, when there were dealings with Romania, or the authority, basically, for those who were perhaps doing more executive tasks on behalf of the Joint.
This question arises from both your discussion, which was quite good, and my own natural curiosity, but I'm not sure that you can respond. The question is, who had the greater role in dealing with the Jewish population of Romania and exacting from it the death and the horror that was the Holocaust? Was it the German influence from outside against an independent country, or was it the latent or virile anti-Semitism that may have existed in Romania before the Germans even arrived on the scene?
Well, again, I think this is a very big question, and I think it's also a question on which there's a large amount of literature, whether Romania's anti-Semitism was providential, or whether what its roots were, who its kind of carriers were, and I don't feel really qualified to give you a simple answer to something so.
I'm not asking for a simple answer. I'm just asking for an instinctive answer.
I don't think I even have that. I mean, I think you can make arguments in different ways. I definitely think Nazi Germany and the Second World War created an environment that just enabled violence. And I don't think one can really think of the Holocaust without taking into account this wartime context. And obviously, the German influence on Romania was significant. But I also think it's been in the historiography for many decades, especially under communism. Romania's used that as an excuse to not look closer at what the actions they took during the war, and I think that's something one needs to be very careful with. So it's all about different factors and balancing, and what is one actually looking at, so that will maybe a smaller question can be answered and contribute to that larger question.
Thank you very much for coming, and we encourage you to look at some of the material we have in the back. Thank you.